Hello, welcome to this week's Bible study out of Explore the Bible. Today's lesson is out of Luke chapter 23, verses 33 through 46. It's intended for May the 16th, 2021, and it's titled Sacrificed. All right, I know Easter was celebrated last month, but we're towards the end of our study in Luke, and of course we have the Crucifixion again. What are some of the words that you associate with Easter? Well, of course, the title we have for our lesson today is sacrificed. That might be a word that would be there in your mind. Or crucifixion is another. Trials, scourging, salvation, and other words that might come to your mind. You know, even though Easter was celebrated last month, what Christ did on the cross doesn't affect just one season of the year. It affects our lives every single day. And so that's why we're looking at this lesson today. There's a book called Lives Given, Not Taken, and it details the sacrifices of 8 missionary martyrs. These missionaries went to potential dangerous places because they believed God called them to serve people in hard-to-reach areas of the world. They took serious risks so others might know Jesus. From medical workers slain at a clinic to relief personnel assassinated by gunmen on motorcycles, they gave their lives because Jesus first sacrificed himself for them. So, how does Jesus' sacrifice on the cross motivate you? Kind of a rhetorical question there. All right. Of course, we've been looking at events within the Passion Week for the last couple of weeks in our studies. Last week, we looked at Peter's denial of Christ at his beginning of his trial there in Jerusalem, the night he was arrested. And this week's session is about the crucifixion, of course. Well, after the trials, Jesus was scourged. Scourged meant he was publicly whipped. I don't know if you've ever seen the production of Mel Brooks that he produced called, I can't remember now, The Passion, I believe was the name of it. I think it was one of the most hard to watch movies that I've ever seen because it literally depicted the scourging in a very graphic way of Jesus prior to his carrying his cross up Mount Calvary. The whip that was used by the Romans was called the cat o' nine tails. It would have pieces of metal or something in the ends of it, which created kind of barbs, so that you just didn't get whipped. The barbs would tear into the flesh and tear the flesh from your back. And Christ was whipped 40 times and was still coherent enough that they made him start carrying his cross. But as he was carrying his cross on the way to Mount Calvary, he was in such a weakened condition that he stumbled numerous times, such that Simon of Cyrene was pulled out of the crowd after the last time he stumbled and was forced to carry the cross for Christ up Mount Calvary. And so we get to our first reading for today. As I read our first passage, which is Luke chapter 22, verses 33 through 34, I want you to listen for the details of Jesus' crucifixion. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, or Galgotha, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on the right hand and one on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, because they did not know what they are doing." And they divided his clothes and cast lots. Now, the crucifixion itself was one of the most cruel ways of punishment that the Romans could think of. The individual would have been, and each cross is a little bit different based upon what you see. Most of the crosses were such that it was more like a T instead of a cross that we're familiar with. And what they carried up was the cross beam that they were suspended from. The criminal or the victim, whichever you want to consider, would have been laid down on the ground with their shoulders on top of the beam. Their hands would have been stretched out to either side. They would have had their arms tied to the beam so that they couldn't move. Then one of the soldiers would have taken a long metal spike. And contrary to what you think, they would have taken and placed the spike at this part of the arm and would have driven it into the wood with a hammer. Very painful, very excruciating. And if you are any bit familiar with anatomy, there is a great bundle of nerves right here. Anybody that has suffered from carpal tunnel syndrome will know that you get very painful things here. Just feel it and push on it. You can feel it very well. Therefore, with your arms like this, then you would have been, the beam would have been drawn up to the top of the upright, and it would settle on top of the upright, and you would have been suspended from the ground. The feet were then taken and crossed over each other, pushed up a little bit where the knees were bent, and then another stake would have been taken and driven through the top of each foot into the wood. Again, a very painful operation. And usually it wasn't just one individual. I mean, this would require more than one. And in this instance, Jesus was crucified between two other criminals. And it was prophesied in Isaiah 53, which is called the Suffering Servant chapter in Isaiah, that he would have been numbered with the transgressors. And we see that this was prophesied centuries before the event was to take place. The crucifixion was a slow, agonizing death because they really weren't the punishment wasn't designed to kill them instantly. It was intended to kill them slowly. They basically suffocated because being suspended like they were, they would have been hunched over. And as they hunch over, your breathing takes place because of a muscle under your rib cage area called your diaphragm, which expands your lungs and allows air to come in. With you bent over like that, it's hard for your diaphragm to work. Therefore, the only way that the person on the cross could breathe would be painfully lift themselves up by the spikes in their body and push off with their feet to raise themselves up enough to where they could get a few more breaths of air and then slump back down. Loss of blood would have been minimal, not enough to be life-threatening, but enough to weaken the individual. They would have been suspended in the elements, in the rain, in the heat, in the sun, and therefore no relief. I want you to look at verse 34 of what Jesus said. This was the first thing that he said upon the cross. If you have to really look through most of the Gospels, each of the Gospels tell the story of the crucifixion in a little bit different way. But all of them agree that this was the first thing that Jesus said. He begged forgiveness because I don't know what they're doing. Okay? And again, his concern was still for others. He experienced excruciating pain on the cross, but he did not pray for personal relief. The first thing he did was ask for forgiveness for his tormentors. And really not sure whether he was talking about the Jewish leadership themselves. I'm sure they thought they were trying to protect the integrity of their religion, but they weren't aware that this was God. This was the Son of God on the cross that they were treating in such an apprehensible way. So how does Jesus' declaration that we see in begging forgiveness for people point to his purpose? If you remember correctly, in John, I believe it is, it tells us that he did not come to have life easy. He was sent to earth to seek that which was lost, to redeem the people back to God. He was the sacrificial lamb as depicted in the Old Testament sacrificial system to atone for the sins of others. The lamb did no wrong other than being perfect, having no blemish. So, Jesus was that lamb. Now, the location of Galgotha was on a ridge outside the walls of Jerusalem. If you were looking at a map, it would be off to the top left of the walls of Jerusalem. Thus, it was an elevated place. one that would have been easily seen from all of Jerusalem. And because of the rock formation and how it looked, it was called the place of the skull. It was a place where the cross would be raised. These three crosses would have been very evident. Thus, the tradition within the world today. Churches that commemorate Easter and things like that will normally have three empty crosses sitting on a little knoll someplace, because they would have been readily seen by all people. Luke is the only gospel writer to use the Greek term for skull, which is cranium, instead of the Aramaic term Galgotha. So the word Calvary comes from the Latin translation of skull. So now we have Jesus on the cross between two thieves. He was no victim. If he had not embraced the Father's will in the garden, these men would have had no power over him. He knew his atoning sacrifice was the only way we can be forgiven, or anyone can be forgiven. So, before I start reading our second passage, which is Luke 23, verses 35 through 39. Not only the people of the day of Jesus, but if this were to happen today, what do you think the reaction of people would be around Jesus on the cross? Think of that for a moment. What would have been the reaction? Now, let's see what did happen. Starting in verse 35. The people stood watching, and even the leaders were scoffing. He saved others. Let him save himself, if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him. They came offering him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." An inscription was written above him, "This is the King of the Jews." Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." You know, we see it evident in our world today. How many times have you seen it on the news? Particularly in a police case or something of that nature, where someone appears to be being abused, or someone thinks that the police are going too far, or someone is actually, the case in Houston, where the young man was running through the neighborhood and was attacked by two others. Why did we get to see this on the news? We got to see this on the news because people were standing around with these videotaping and recording what was going on. Pass by any serious accident on the road, and what happens? Traffic doesn't slow down just to be safe around the workers, but it slows down to the point where people have time to look and see any gory details that are going on. Everybody has an opinion about what transpired to put a person in jeopardy. Even during the height of 9/11, what was happening? People were standing around gawking in the streets prior to the towers starting to collapse. People wanted to see. People, I'm sure, were making comments. There's always somebody around willing to make a statement based upon what they think and may not know all the facts. So, we have the commentary here of those standing around the cross. Now, I want you to realize that there were probably clusters of people that had tears in their eyes, that were weeping. Followers of Jesus that had gone up and were seeing the man that they thought was the Messiah hanging on the cross. There was at least one of his disciples there, John. There was his mother and other women that were there. Can you imagine Mary being at the foot of that cross, seeing the boy that she had brought into this world and raised being treated in this manner? Mary, did you know? So, we had gawkers and hangers-on even in the time of Jesus. This is nothing new. Stood around seeing what was going to happen. Was there going to be some more blood? And the leadership mocking him. You saved others. Save yourself. If you're really God's Messiah, the chosen one, save yourself. Yet Jesus wouldn't do that. He knew what he was getting into when he accepted the call of God in that garden. Could he have called 10,000 angels? Yes. He could have called legions down, just like he will appear in the final great battle. But it wasn't time for the battle. It was time for sacrifice. The soldiers mocked him. Soldiers are some of the most cruel. Soldiers and police officers have what they call gallows humor. They help get through some of the things that they have to do by making fun of it, by making a joke of it. And here they're mocking him. They're offering him sour wine. They're gambling for his clothes. They even had a sign made and put over his head, King of the Jews, to the point that one of the criminals that was with him railed at him, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself." But not save yourself, but save us. If he only knew that's what Jesus was doing. Exactly what he was doing. He wasn't there to save the body. He was there to save the soul, to redeem the spirit back to the Father. What do the statements of the mockers reveal about their misunderstanding of the Messiah? Well, as I've told you, Isaiah prophesied about the suffering servant centuries before. If they would have been the leaders that they should have been, they would have recalled these passages and known that they were fulfilling the very prophecies that Isaiah had written centuries before through this man that they put on the cross. So, if you're the Messiah, yeah, he's the Messiah. He's the anointed one. He's doing exactly what the Father wanted him to do. They saw the truth, but because their hearts were so hardened, they did not recognize the truth. Jesus is the Christ. Christ is the translation of the Greek word meaning Messiah. Messiah meaning the anointed one. He was the Christ. No matter what anyone else may say, that doesn't change that fact. He was the anointed one, sent by God to suffer and die for our sins. Now, as I read our next passage, which is Luke 23, verses 40 through 43, I want you to notice the attitude of the other criminal to Jesus. And it reads, "But the other answered, rebuking him," the one that has spoken before, "Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly because we're getting back what we deserved for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he, Jesus, said unto him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Okay. First of all, what the criminal said in verses 40 through 42. Okay? He has done nothing wrong. Do you not even fear God? That tells me that this man recognized who Jesus was. What's the first point of salvation? One of the most crucial points of salvation, of recognizing who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. He is God. And recognizing that Jesus was going through the same punishment unto death that they were going through, yet he told his fellow criminal, we deserve what we're getting, but this man has done nothing wrong. He knew that Jesus was innocent. Maybe he was present when Pontius Pilate stated, I find nothing wrong with this man. Who do you want me to give you back? Do you want me to give you Jesus, or do you want me to give you Barabbas? And then he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So, what are the elements of salvation? One, recognizing that we're a sinner. Did this man recognize that he was a sinner? We are punished justly. We're getting back what we deserve. Yes, he recognizes that he was a sinner. Don't you even fear God? He recognized who God, Jesus, was. Then he pleads with him. He calls upon the name of Jesus, which is what you must do in order to be saved. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus gives him the affirmative. You will be with me today in paradise. Why might people choose to mock Jesus, then turn to him? It's much like a person that is thrown into quicksand. They will grasp at anything that they think can keep them from dying. The same thing with someone that is drowning in water. People that are trained to rescue people that are drowning in water recognize that they must come up and get in behind the person, not approach them on front ways, because that person is going to try to grab and crawl out of their danger and will endanger the person that is trying to bring them rescue. It's an important skill that is taught to people who work around places where people get in danger of water. But what happens when we fail to ignore the reality of our sin? Well, how many of the men on the cross did Jesus say would be with him in paradise that day? There were one on each side. One of them didn't recognize his sin, and therefore he was not with Jesus in paradise that day. There is no way he will have another chance to be with Jesus in paradise. His opportunity was at that moment, at the crossroads of his physical life, and he squandered it away by mocking the very person that could rescue him. And that's what many people in the world do today. They thumb their nose. I don't need God. I don't need Jesus. I'm perfectly happy the way I am. Verses 39 through 43 are unique to the book of Luke. And by this, we get an additional significance because Luke 1 is a physician, okay? And so he knows the things that are going on in the body of these people hanging on the cross. Luke was not present at the crucifixion that we know of. But Luke did interview witnesses who were and saw the things that he wrote about in his gospel. He got firsthand eyewitness accounts and then wrote about them as a physician would do. In verse 43 is our memory verse for this week. And he said to him, "Truly I tell you, you will be with me in paradise." And this is the promise that Jesus still makes today for anyone who comes through faith to Jesus, comes to faith, to salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the only way we have. Nothing that the criminal on the other side could do would be able to save him. Nothing that anybody that said out in the mocking crowd said would be able to save them. Only the confession that was made by the other criminal on the cross, recognizing his sin, recognizing who was in a position to provide him salvation, and then calling upon that name in faith and believing that he would do it. Oh. That is our definition of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. The confession of that second criminal. Jesus, remember me. So, we have one other passage to read, but I'm going to ask you to do something unusual today to do that. I want you to close your eyes and just listen to my voice and the words that I will be speaking to you, and help that transport you in your mind to the foot of that cross at the moment that the scriptures talk about. You got your eyes closed, got your ears open. Listen as I read Luke 23, verses 44 through 46. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light failed. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle, And Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. Saying this, he breathed his last. All right, you can open your eyes now. Now, I know from past experience in that a solar eclipse does not last 3 hours. At the most, the darkness that takes place in a solar eclipse lasts but seconds. And it's not even total then, because you have a dimming of light, but you still have the flashing of the corona around the penumbrum, I think is what it's called, the moon shadow. So you still have some light, but total darkness, because the sun's light failed. What happened to transpire to have that happen? I don't know. No clue, other than I know God was involved. Okay? And then the significance of the splitting of the sanctuary curtain. This was the curtain that hung between the Holy of Holies and the holy place. The holy place was where the showbread and the candelabra was placed, along with the incense altar. Behind the curtain would have been the Ark of the Covenant. And it was only approached once a year during the time of atonement by the high priest only. But the curtain, it doesn't tell us too much detail in here, but in other Gospels it tells us that that curtain, which was very heavy, was not like you see hanging in your windows, but was a very heavy curtain. It was split, not from the bottom to the top, but from the top to the bottom. Many scholars signify this as being that access to God was now opened up to everyone, and it was initiated by God himself by rending the curtain from the top to the bottom. We no longer need any other intermediary to go before God for us other than the one who sacrificed his life. Christ now is our advocate before the Father as he sits at the right hand of God in heaven, awaiting the moment God tells him it's time for him to go and get his church. How does Jesus' death remove the barrier between sinful humanity and the holy God? It's because we don't come to God in our righteousness. We come to God in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. He stands before us, between us and God, in his holiness and in his righteousness, and covered in his blood that atones for our sin. That's the only way. He has removed that barrier. And elsewhere in scriptures, it tells us that we are given the privilege of being called the children of God. We are adopted into the family through the sacrifice that Christ made for us. And we see here in verse 46, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. Saying this, he breathed his last. That passage about into your hands I entrust my spirit is a direct quote from Psalms 31, which was often used as a bedtime prayer by children in ancient Israel. So our version of it is today is, now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Probably came from that passage of scripture. Jesus closed his eyes like a child in the darkness of night, with the confidence and assurance that he would be awakened by the brightness of morning. All I can add to this today is, where are you standing at the cross? Are you standing with all the mockers, the ones poking fun at Jesus? Are you ridiculing him?